Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to be joined as ever by Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And an extra special guest making her debut on the show, Miriam Cates, current GB News presenter and former Conservative MP. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. We've got loads to discuss today. We'll be talking about Rachel Reeves' dash for growth, whether you're an extremist if you're worried about grooming gangs, and finally the assisted dying bill and some of the shenanigans in Parliament. Before we get on to that, I just want to remind everyone at home that if you're a Spike supporter, you can come to our 25th anniversary event. Find out more by just going to the Spike website and logging into the Supporters Hub. So, Rachel Reeves delivered a major speech this week setting out the UK government's growth plans. She talked about expanding Heathrow, essentially stopping everyone from being able to block developments on the grounds of protecting newts and bats and things like that, making it harder for activists to block various developments. Miriam, what did you make of the speech and the sort of direction this is going in?
Well, I think there was a lot in there that most people can support across the political spectrum. Some of them are ideas that kind of started or were announced under the Conservative government. And there's a lot of common sense in there. You won't find many people thinking that it's a good idea to spend millions of pounds on bat tunnels or that red tape is good. So very common sense. And I think brave in its own way, because the left has been captured by extreme environmentalism, which I do think is directly opposed to economic growth. So I think that there was bravery in there. I think we need to dig deeper than just a lot of cliches, which are in the speech. Yes, I support expansion of Heathrow. I support, Oxford-Cambridge corridor. But I suppose two questions are, what's the chances of it actually being achieved? And secondly, why do we need growth? Because I think that's a really important question. So on the first one, good luck to them. I hope they're successful. I hope they dismantle some of the bureaucracy and the red tape in planning particularly. I really support the idea of limiting people's ability to JR ad infinitum, to judicial review ad infinitum. I think that's a good thing. But I saw some of it as a backbencher in Parliament, and I know colleagues in government. The British state has become so sclerotic, so much. It is really difficult to know where to start, especially when there's a whole generation of civil servants now who haven't known anything else. And the idea of letting go of some of these rules and regulations will be very, very challenging. And I think, ultimately, we no longer have a kind of cohesive idea of the nation and what the vision of the nation is, and therefore we have to have lots of rules to make sure that people don't misbehave. So I wish them luck. I think it's difficult. But I think that there's a fundamental question. Why do we need economic growth? And, the most obvious cause is the fact that we are so indebted as a country that we spend £100 billion a year on debt interest alone. That's way more than the defence budget, for example, and the schools budget. And because of interest rates and inflation, the debt's getting bigger and bigger. So unless we grow, unless we increase our kind of income as a country, we are absolutely stuck. So I think that's the first important point to note. And secondly, that productivity, yes, is one part of growth, but actually a really important part of growth is population itself. Now, I don't mean immigration. I'm sure we'll come on to that. I mean having babies. And I know you knew that I'd come on to this at some point.
I'm impressed you got it in there.
Exactly, in five minutes. But if you think about this, in the early 1960s, 900,000 babies were born a year. Last year, fewer than 600,000. So for every 3 people retiring at the moment, you've just got 2 coming into the workplace. You cannot grow if your kind of natural workforce is shrinking. And actually, one of the reasons Thatcher did experience such good growth, she reaped the dividend of the baby boom. She was in power when that post-war baby boomers were coming into their most productive age, their 30s and their 40s. And she reaped the rewards with that. And unless we get to grips with what our failing birth rate really means in terms of population growth, not just growth, actually, just stability, that's all we're looking for, then no government doing anything is going to get that kind of growth.
Yeah. I think, you can tie many of the things that Reeves was saying together with that. I mean, the fact that there is a housing crisis caused by a lot of these arcane planning rules means that many, young adults are living with their parents instead of having their own homes. People don't have the space to start a family. The economy in general means that people are nervous about making and committing to these decisions. So, the two things are definitely, there's a chicken and egg situation there a little bit.
Definitely.
Tom, what did you make of this speech?
Similarly, I think there were things within it that you could welcome, whilst also recognising that a lot of this were projects which had already been approved previously, had been sitting on the shelf for a number of years, had been victim of various administrations just having to park them to one side for all kinds of different reasons. So a good start. But in the same way that I think there wasn't a clear kind of vision of why growth is actually important, it's just a phrase that Rachel Reeves likes to repeat ad infinitum as if by sheer incantation it will therefore actually appear.
50 times I counted.
Really?
51 times in the speech.
Just to really hammer it home. But also, it's quite clear that we're not going to have proper economic growth until we have a reckoning with the greenism properly. Like at the moment, the government believes that it can have its cake and eat it, that if it essentially takes the carbon budget and shifts some of it around away from aviation towards something else, that everything will be fine. Whereas it's becoming abundantly clear to the public, if not to the government at this point, that you can have economic growth or you can have net zero, you can't have both.
Yeah.
And you're seeing that in the polling as well. This is a debate that, generally speaking, hasn't really been one that has been at the centre of political life, I think it's fair to say. There was a hell of a lot of consensus. The Climate Change Act back in 2008 was a cross-party supported piece of legislation. But because of how bad things have gotten, because of how expensive energy has become across the board, of course, but particularly in the UK, people are really starting to notice this stuff now. There was an Ashcroft poll this week which showed that you're seeing basically a pretty strong majority or plurality against net zero, depending on how you pose the question. People know that we could impoverish ourselves and it would still make barely any difference because, America or China just so much have to do is pass wind and it completely, erases any sort of savings we've made. And yet it seems like, as ever, the politicians are the slowest ones to catch up. They are still kind of saying that we'll just shuffle these things around. We'll try to basically contain the environmentalist backlash within our own party. But that broader reckoning with this idea that they are signed up to a policy of immiseration whilst they're trying to talk about economic growth, it's just not going to work.
Yeah,
some of these projects might come off, but across the piece, you're not going to see that growth that everyone claims that they want to see.
Exactly. I mean, Rachel Reeves said net zero was the economic opportunity of the 21st century. So she obviously sees the green tape as being a problem, but is not seeing the fundamental problem of sacrificing entire industries to this one cause.
I don't think she really believes it anymore. I mean, that would be my assessment. I think it's becoming so clear that the net zero agenda is one of economic suicide. And it is just so stupid. All we've done is offshored our carbon production.
Yeah.
And actually, we've probably increased world emissions because the things that we now buy from China and Turkey and all the other places are produced with a bigger carbon footprint to start with, and then they're transported over here. And in the meantime, we've destroyed our steel industry. We've destroyed, and it's not just the offshoring that's the problem. It's our crazily high energy prices, mostly as a result of renewable energy. So we've crucified our own industry. We've raked up our energy prices, and we've probably contributed to an increase in global emissions in doing that. But I think what it shows is just the power of ideas. Climate catastrophism captured pretty much everybody in the political class, and it did become a religion. It became impossible to challenge it. That's decreasing now, but it shows that an idea like that can influence policy. It's the same with population catastrophism, which happened a few decades before, which was the world's overpopulated, we're all going to starve. It was utter rubbish, but it absolutely changed not only governments' thinking and policy, but our own psyche about whether it's immoral to have children, all these other kind of things. It essentially built on a lie, as the net zero agenda was, and yet the power it has in the political sphere is just incredible.
And, you'll still get many climate campaigners, environmental campaigners who don't realise that any of this has happened.
Yeah.
They think that we're giddily burning.
They think wind energy is cheap, as we are constantly told. Yeah.
I mean, that again is something that clearly has to unravel at some point. It will come to a head, surely. I mean, as long as Ed Miliband, I guess, is in office.
Yeah, he's a very useful foil.
Yeah,
I thought he'd gone missing. Has he reappeared?
He's still there. He's not showing up at public events. He's staying markedly quiet. I think as long as this Heathrow discussion is going to be in the centre of political debate, he's not going to want to be seen in front of a television camera. But that's the other thing about it, is the speed with which you're again seeing kind of Labour flip-flopping these questions. You had Keir Starmer opposed Heathrow expansion not that long ago. And when, I think you made this point in your piece about it, Fraser, when Rachel Reeves said she was genuinely surprised by how difficult it was to build anything. She was genuinely surprised about the £100 million bat tunnel. She was genuinely surprised about the amount of both planning restrictions and sort of green tape which existed. I do kind of believe her. I think a lot of people have ignored a lot of this. They assumed that people who would talk about it were just libertarian think tankers or headbangers or whatever. I think the penny is starting to drop. The question is, it's dropping kind of a little bit too slowly, if that doesn't torture the metaphor too much. The public have realised this is a big problem, but the politicians are still kind of tinkering around the edges of environmentalism and what that means for policy, rather than actually getting rid of it.
Definitely. And funny, Miriam, I mean, in the medium term or short term, or whatever, it's clear the UK economy just isn't growing. I mean, it'd be great if some of these projects come off. We always say we want politicians to think long term, and these are some good long term decisions, but we do need growth in the short term, and that seems to have been, things seem to have got worse, like quite noticeably since Labour came in.
Yes, and certainly the budget and this rather bizarre decision to focus on employers' national insurance, and particularly to penalise employing low wage workers, which was, quite a daft idea in many ways, because especially at that level of the employment spectrum, you need flexibility, you need to be able to take people on quickly, and that was a disaster. But I think it was born out of the fact that both major parties have essentially given up on ever changing the basic rate of income tax or VAT, or what was the other one that they promised to? National insurance. As in employers.
Well, they said anything on your paycheck.
Yeah.
You won't see on your paycheck.
So because mainstream politicians now seem to think that unless they do that, they are unelectable. Labour tied themselves into a corner. Now, I'm not saying that a tax rise was necessary. There are many schools of thought on that. Although, if you do look at our ageing demographic, it's hard to escape the fact that because people live so much longer than they used to and are therefore economically inactive for much longer than ever has been the case before, we are all going to have to pay more during our working lives. I do think that's inevitable. But a much fairer and easier and more effective way of getting a few billion extra pounds is to put a penny on the basic rate of income tax. That people don't notice that particularly. You can't avoid it. You can't change your behaviour in order to get out of it. And for every one penny on the rate of income tax, you get £8 billion, let's say. But that would be the most obvious, fair, and least growth squashing way to do it. But their hands are tied. And I think the problem is the public have been told for so long, we don't need to raise taxes, we won't raise taxes, that now people think you can't get elected unless you promise not to. And then you have to find yourselves coming up with all sorts of other ways of fiddling the tax system to get more money. But the trouble with those other ways is that they involve choice. Businesses can choose not to employ people. People can choose not to buy and sell assets. And so it becomes much more tricky to get the money in.
Tom, anything you want to add?
Well, I think it also underlines the importance of, if we actually had anything like meaningful economic growth, which we haven't really had since the financial crisis. There's a tendency to see this as a quite the last few years kind of phenomenon. But because of that more than a decade of lost growth, we're in a situation where politicians are confronted with much more difficult choices they otherwise would have to make. And yet, even so, they're not willing to actually countenance those choices. So we're really stuck in this particular position. But it is worth underlying that we've gone from a situation where at the beginning of last year, we went from having terrible, but anemic growth effectively to now having zero. And the fact that that happened under a Labour government committed to growth with a laser-like focus, I think is telling of how much they've messed this up. This was, I think, quite rightly the thing that they needed to focus on, because of just how much simple cost of living bread and butter issues had really infuriated people with the last government, and yet they've failed to even create any positive indicators other than set piece speeches. So again, it does all come down to growth. Rachel Reeves is right about that, but no one believes that they're going to get a grip on this.
Here at Spiked, we've long warned about the dangers that big tech poses to free speech. And increasingly, your privacy is under threat too. Now, you might not know this, but about half of what ends up in your email inbox every day is actually tracked. So loads of those newsletters and promotional emails that you're getting, a lot of them are actually trying to spy on you. The truth is, our digital lives are a lot less private than we think. So if you're serious about reclaiming your privacy, then you need to start using Proton Mail. Proton Mail is the world's largest secure email service. It provides you with a private and secure alternative to traditional servers. Thanks to its end-to-end encryption, only the intended recipient can read the messages that are sent via Proton Mail. Not even Proton Mail itself can access or decrypt your emails. Your privacy and your data remains completely confidential, just as it should be. Proton Mail is an essential tool in helping you fight back against the intrusions of the state and big tech in your private life. It completely safeguards you from hacking and government surveillance. Proton Mail detects phishing attempts and blocks invisible trackers and targeted ads. It also promises an ad-free experience, so big tech can't make a cent out of your private data. Your data is yours. Keep it that way with Proton Mail's privacy-first email service. Just go to proton.me/spikedpodcast or click the link in the description to get started, and you'll get a 38% discount. That's proton.me/spikedpodcast. So, are you worried about grooming gangs? Are you concerned about two-tier policing? Then it turns out you might have fallen under the spell of an extremist right-wing narrative. Tom, this is from a leaked sort of rapid review from the Home Office taken in the wake of the horrendous riots in Southport last year. It's come up with a number of recommendations, as well as hinting that some quite normal opinions of right-wing extremists. It suggested expanding the definition of extremism quite broadly, and also recording lots of non-crime hate incidents. Yeah. What have you made of this?
Well, first of all, we should give it its proper name, which is that it was a rapid analytical sprint into the question of extremism, that's your brain on Mandarin ideology, isn't it, to call something like that?
To accompany the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor
exactly.
champion.
Where they come up with this stuff, I don't know. But yeah, this leaked review, Policy Exchange got their hands on it and effectively blew it up before it was even published because of the fact that it did have these outrageous passages in it, which suggested that first of all, the issue of grooming gangs, which they refer to as alleged cases of group-based sexual exploitation. Again, more jargon, but also that word alleged has really stuck in the craw for obvious reasons, given how much that debate has really come back to the focus. Also, this idea of two-tier policing as being a kind of right-wing extremist trope. It's almost like a caricature of what people feared the Home Office and our counter-extremism services had become. It basically vindicates the William Shaw cross-review from 2023, who said that the problem with the way in which the British state deals with extremism is that it's far too much focused on far-right extremism to the point that even the general stuff of right-wing commentary has become suspect in their eyes, and this completely vindicates that. And also the fact that because of that skew, it's not dealing with the fundamentals, which is our primary threat, which of course is Islamist extremism, which despite being that primary threat only makes up about 11% of prevent referrals these days, which is absolutely insane. So the fact that they had to distance themselves from it so quickly in a weird way is a sign of progress. This isn't an independent report. This was people working in the Home Office with Yvette Cooper and Dan Jarvis day to day. The fact that they've had to distance themselves from it so quickly, I think, is indicative of the fact that the debate has moved on. People have realised, even though the Labour Party have made a dog's dinner of these issues and tended to alienate people when they've tried to address them, I think they know they can't get away with this official tendency to try and demonise mainstream opinions on a lot of these issues and to try and deflect attention away from where the real threat lies. So it was another disgraceful chapter in the story of our dealing with this particular issue. But I think that the speed with which they had to drop it was interesting and different to what we might have seen in the more recent past.
Yeah. Miriam, what have you made of it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Tom. I was pleased that they disowned it so quickly. Whether they disowned it because Policy Exchange got their hands on it and shone a light on it or not, I don't know. But it does reveal what our civil servants are thinking, and also that we are living in two parallel political spheres in this country. We've got what you might call the progressive left and the kind of common sense centre right, and they genuinely think differently about issues that we might think are just so obvious, but it's obvious in a different way. And I think that's what's so difficult, because how do you have a meaningful persuasive argument with people who just see things in such a different way? So, and it is hugely concerning, but I suspect at the root of all this is the left are now, they're a rabbit in the headlights. It's been proven that multiculturalism has failed. All this time we've been saying that all cultures are equal, all cultures are equally valid, diversity is our strength. I mean, that is even on the 50p piece. It says Britain was built on diversity, which is obviously rubbish, but that's the level of kind of indoctrination that we've been subjected to. And now those in the kind of civil service class are realising that everybody's eyes have been opened, that it isn't working. But nobody's actually got a solution, because the problem is that people are saying, well, we just need better integration. I'm not sure that is the answer, because there are communities, Orthodox Jewish communities, some Hindu communities, Chinese university students who aren't integrated, who do live in their own, separate societies, almost own schools, own shops. But they're not a problem. I'm not saying it's ideal that we have a society where there are some groups that aren't integrated, but it's not a problem. But this is a problem. Is that because some Muslim communities are incompatible, or at least the values that some of them display, like very obviously the Pakistani men involved in these cases, are actually incompatible with Western liberal values, and no amount of integration is actually going to solve that. So I suspect that there's some rapid backpedaling going on in the establishment class. What the heck do we do now that it's been blown off the failures of multiculturalism? And I don't think anybody does have an answer to that, but certainly lying about it, pretending it's not true, is not the answer. However, I do think there's one thing that Starmer is right about, and parts of this report are right about, which is this idea of the lone wolf that isn't particularly Islamist or extreme right or not ideologically driven, or not in a traditional sense. There isn't a kind of coherent worldview underlying their extremism and violence. I do think that is going to be a growing threat because of the internet and how children, particularly and young men, use the internet. So obviously the Southport murderer was an example of that. But I think there's been a 4-fold increase of children convicted of terrorism in the last 10 years. And that is a very, very mixed picture. They are not, majority of adults convicted of terrorism absolutely are Islamists. Not the case for children. It's much more mixed picture. Some of them far right, some of them incels, some of them Islamists. Yes, but it's really an obsession, almost an addiction to violence that they've come across online and are now at risk of perpetrating. So I do think that's an important factor. I don't think we should dismiss that just because it's not the common thing in the adult population. And also, it calls into question our treatment of the mentally ill, or particularly people with psychiatric conditions. I mean, certainly before the 1960s, we would constrain people with psychological problems that we thought might lead to them being violent. So we would take away their individual liberty to protect the public. We don't do that anymore. We treat people in the community. Very obvious humane reasons for that. But you have got to question if someone is so severely mentally ill, disturbed, whatever you want to call it, that they are going out hitting someone with a hockey stick at their school, threatening violence, their parents are that concerned about, should they be free?
Yeah. And a very similar case, I think, is Valdo Calacane, who stabbed 3 people to death in Nottingham a few years ago. This young man was severely mentally disturbed. He was a paranoid schizophrenic. He was known to the authorities to have been various violent incidents. He was known not to have been engaging, not taking his medication. I think anyone, you can be as supportive of care in the community and trying to make sure people who are struggling with severe mental health issues are treated as humanely as possible, and recognise there's a certain point in which a line is crossed. And the fact that wasn't recognised here, that there was a kind of, well, he's not an extremist, so therefore on your merry way, let's see how it goes. It will strike anyone as completely misplaced. On the point about integration, I think you're right to say that it's a misnomer, particularly when you're talking about the Islamist problem, but for slightly different reasons. I think, the vast majority of Muslim communities in Britain do not need to be integrated into the idea that you shouldn't blow people up.
No, absolutely.
Or do not need to be integrated into the idea that grooming gangs are a horrific scandal. I think the issue where Islamism in particular is concerned is that there's just a fundamental lack of seriousness with tackling it for all of the politically correct reasons that we're talking about. I mean, you think about something like the Manchester Arena bombing, whereby the kind of, it's a combination of either ineptitude or kind of collective naivety, which seems to greet a lot of these terrorists. They're going for, some of them, in some cases, it's prevent. In the case of Manchester Arena, it was MI5. He was under surveillance, and yet the ease with which he was travelling back and forth from Libya, where he was believed to have been received training by the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, of which his father was a member. The fact that these things are allowed to go on without it actually triggering some kind of intervention, you do come back to the position, which is that time and again, the authorities, the political class, are more interested in protecting the reputation of multiculturalism than stopping kids from being abused or blown up.
Absolutely.
And people are within their rights to come to that conclusion now without falling victim to a far-right extremist narrative or whatever.
But I do I mean, I completely agree with you, but I do think there are also questions about Islam or ordinary Islam. I mean, of course, I am not calling all British Muslims Islamists, and absolutely many British Muslims will be absolutely horrified by the grooming gangs and also the many Islamic extremist plots and things like that we've experienced. But for example, the attitude of Islam to women, that's not, in many cases, especially conservative Islam, that's not particularly compatible with Western culture. 25% of British Muslims don't believe Hamas raped and killed on October the 7th. 25%. That's not a tiny fraction. Now, speaking as a person of faith myself, if I moved to another country, would I adapt my religious beliefs to suit the country? No, I wouldn't, because my faith is more important to me than another political system. I think these are reasonable questions to ask that should be done absolutely in a sensitive way, and completely acknowledging the fact that most Muslims make a contribution to society. They've come here legally, like the vast majority of people, strongly believe in their families, communities like we do, but we should be able to have a discussion about what are the values of different religions, at what point do they clash, and what do we do about it? And
it's also quite clear that over time, the multicultural state has boosted the most hardline conservative and in some cases extreme factions within Islam. I mean, through this whole practice of funding supposedly representative community groups, anointing supposed community leaders, time and time again, the people that the state has chosen to anoint are the most hardline regressive individuals who then claim to speak on behalf of the entire community, who then really set the tone of the debate about what needs to be done about certain issues which might be affecting that community or emanating from that particular community. So it becomes a kind of real vicious circle, I suppose.
And they reinforce people's prejudices.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you end up in the same position. So it's just, at the core of all this is a nervousness about talking about it and confronting it.
Yeah.
And if we got rid of that, then we could actually start to have those difficult but obviously sensitive conversations as to how we navigate our way out of this in a liberal fashion, I suppose.
I'm always amused as a story comes up every now and again. They'll find an extremist group operating in Britain legally that's banned in Qatar and various other Islamic countries. Have you ever dreamed of starting your own business? Well, there's never been a better time to make that dream a reality. And it's possible because of something that sounds like this. That's the sound of another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one e-commerce platform that's revolutionizing businesses across the world. No matter how much digital or business experience you have, Shopify gives you all the tools you need to start and grow your own business, whether you're selling football shirts or vintage skirts. Shopify is designed to help you out at every stage of your business journey. It covers all of your sales platforms and even gets you selling across those all-important social media marketplaces. And it's simple and easy to use. Shopify gives you total control over your business and brand direction, and you'll never have to worry about learning new skills in design or coding. Simplicity really is one of the best things about Shopify, and as a business owner, the less things you need to worry about, the better. Shopify accepts all payment types, taking the hassle out of getting paid, and its single dashboard means you can manage shipping, orders, and payments no matter where you are in the world. So, it's time to get serious about selling and get Shopify today. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. We should talk a little bit about the Conservative Party. We've been focusing a lot on the Labour's various policies. Lots happening on the right, I think it's fair to say. How do you think Kemi Badenoch's doing? How do you think she's handling the challenge coming from Nigel Farage and reform?
I mean, I think she's doing really well in the circumstances, and they are really, really challenging circumstances, because a lot of people are comparing her to Thatcher and say, Thatcher wasn't popular when she started. She had a lot to learn. She improved very quickly. But Thatcher wasn't facing a threat from the right. And I think that, that makes Kemi's job incredibly challenging, because the other factor is that people aren't ready to listen to Conservatives because they're still absolutely and rightly blaming the Conservative Party for a lot of what happened. So many of our problems boil down to uncontrolled immigration over the last few years, and that was an unforced error from Boris Johnson, and possibly changed the face of our country forever. So people are understandably angry and not interested in a Conservative Party that says it's got the answers. So again, she's going to struggle to be heard. But I think, it's a really interesting dynamic between Conservatives and Reform, because essentially there's not that much difference in most policy areas in terms of the people who vote Conservative and vote Reform, and many of the members. But I think the parliamentary party has probably still got a challenge, which is that it is a mixture of Liberals and Conservatives. And for all the reasons that the Conservative Party failed over the last 5 years, I think probably are still there. I think they're more motivated in opposition to come together over certain points. So, for example, one of the things I fought for over the last few years was transparency in schools and banning mobile phones in schools. none of which the government was particularly interested in. And now, in opposition, they're laying down amendments to try and get this because it's an opposition point to take. And, there's political mileage in it, and I'm sure they believe it's right to do. But, I worry that underneath everything, there is a fundamental disagreement between a group of people who believe that international law and liberalism should be the guiding force, and those who are more kind of small c, socially conservative. But I don't think Reform are going to escape that problem either, because yes, they are populist in the sense that they are talking about things that the Conservative Party have been too frightened of talking about for a long time, immigration. And I'm an admirer of Nigel Farage. I think he's a brilliant politician. But it's still unclear to me whether they are Thatcherites, whether they are post-liberals. I mean, they voted, I think 3 out of the 5 Reform MPs voted for assisted suicide, for the state to kill people, which is in my view, absurd, both libertarian and anti-human position. So who are social conservatives supposed to vote for? That isn't clear. And I worry that as Reform gets more established and more popular, as they are doing, they're going to face exactly the same splits as the Conservative Party does.
And who are disgruntled Labour voters supposed to vote for if they have a more social democratic view of the economy? It's not clear where Reform stands.
There are people in both the Conservative Party and the Reform policy who would call themselves, J.D. Vance post-liberals, and there are people who are absolute libertarian Thatcherites.
I mean, in a way, the Reform is a bit of an outlier amongst right populist parties, insofar as it is wedded to a more Thatcherite, to use broad brushstrokes, kind of ideology, at least in terms of its leadership, at least in terms of its most prominent MPs. That's quite unusual. And it's not a mistake that you've now got Labour really going on the attack against Reform, which on the one hand is an acknowledgement that they are a genuine threat to them in many of those seats where they came second to Labour, but also going after them on the questions of the NHS, previous ideas that Farage had kind of half-thinkingly floated about how it should be funded and so on. Is always going to be a problem for them. But I think so long as the debate remains framed around a lot of these other issues that we've been talking about, they are obviously going to continue to clean up to a degree.
Now, chances are you've promised yourself a million times that you're going to use the new year to try and get healthy. But then by February, it all goes wrong. You go back to the old routine. You just get too busy to think about those kinds of things. But I can tell you, there is a way to combine a really busy life with staying healthy. And it's called AG1. Since I started drinking AG1 every morning, my health has improved enormously. AG1 is packed with minerals and healthy bacteria, which helps me kickstart my day. It's also improved my energy levels and made me far less reliant on caffeine throughout the day. It's the convenience of AG1 that I find so hard to beat. All you need to do is mix 1 scoop in a glass with water. I usually have mine first thing in the morning before breakfast. It's one of the best and easiest things I've ever done for my health. And AG1 has really had a positive impact on everything, from my immune system to my general mood. The team of scientists behind AG1 have more than 100 years of combined experience behind them from fields like genetics, biochemistry, and regenerative medicine. So this really, really works. So why not give it a shot? If you want to support your health now and in the long run, start with AG1. Subscribe now and get a free bottle of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. Just go to drinkag1.com/spiked. Check it out. That's drinkag1.com/spiked. And Miriam, you mentioned assisted dying. I'd like to talk a bit about that now. Have you been following what's been going on in Parliament? Because I have to say that the committee stage of a bill is not normally something that makes the news. But there's been a lot of shenanigans with Kim Leadbeater, who's trying to push this bill through, trying to basically get her own way, minimise scrutiny. What have you made of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting, concerning. I think it's highlighted the fact that if you did want to bring in some sort of assisted suicide legislation, I mean, I am opposed on principle, but if you wanted to bring some in, a private member's bill is a very poor way of doing it. There aren't the opportunities for scrutiny. There are all sorts of consultations that don't happen under private members' bills. And really, I mean, private members' bills are there for doing things like, banning pet theft and, fairly kind of obscure, niche, minor interest things.
The weekly virtue signalling bill.
Exactly.
We're against bad stuff.
Exactly.
What was that one the other week about there's not enough female footballers?
Yeah, exactly.
On Hallmark cards.
Things like that, make penny sweets only cost a penny or something like that. But so this is not what the private member bill process is designed for. But nevertheless, it is a tool of social liberals that has been used repeatedly. I mean, the abortion law, for example. And on top of that, the fact that we say, it's a conscience vote, because MPs are so much more liberal than the public at whole and have been for 50 years, they've got a clear advantage in terms of parliamentary numbers. But what seems very, very concerning is that a lot of MPs voted for the bill at second reading on the basis that it would be well scrutinised, that the bill's proponents would be open to sensible amendments, and that safeguards would be considered. Now, I think the bill's fallen apart in committee stage because disabled rights groups, palliative care doctors, lawyers have all argued that it's either wrong or insufficient or full of holes or people be coerced. And yet very clearly Kim Leadbeater is trying to shut down debate. I mean, there've been extraordinary scenes of her actually interrupting witnesses, and being told off by the chair. But my worry is that anybody neutral following it, or anybody objective or rational following it, would say, hang on a minute, even if you're not opposed to assisted suicide in principle, this is not a safe bill. My worry is that so many Labour backbenchers, who I have to say just seem to be just do whatever the party tells them. They won't, they're just interested in pleasing Keir Starmer, and he's very clearly in favour of this, and they'll just vote for it. And the consequences will just be astonishing. I mean, anyone who's looked at what happened in Canada, in even the kind of most cursory detail, no jurisdiction where assisted suicide has been brought in has it stayed within the narrow confines of the original bill.
Yeah.
Because once you've established a right to die, why should you not spread that right out to all sorts of other... Why 6 months? Why not 7? Why only adults? Why do you have to be terminally ill? Why not just suffering? Why not mental illness? Once you've crossed the Rubicon, once you've broken that kind of Western civilizational boundary that's been there since the dawn of Christianity, basically, that human life is sacred and it's not for others to take it away. It's not even for you to take it away. Then that's it. All bets are off.
Yeah. Tom?
The focus on safeguards, I think, has been really interesting. First of all, because a lot of these safeguards have turned out not to be safeguards at all. But if the entire focus of a piece of legislation passing is how can we protect innocent people from the consequences of your proposed reform, maybe it's not a very good reform to pass in the first place. The caginess around this has been shot through the whole process. I remember when it was originally in the House of Commons, the amount of tone policing that was going on, Daniel Kruger being told off for using the phrase suicide. And that has continued through. I mean, that blow up of the other week where originally it seemed like the committee were going to stop the Royal College of Psychiatrists from addressing them, despite the fact that this piece of legislation will amend the Suicide Act. This is something that you would imagine the Royal College of Psychiatrists might have something to say about it. It's almost like they know that they're losing ground, that they're losing some of the moral authority on this issue. I think Kim Leadbeater's kind of tetchiness is indicative of that. And I think it's one in a long line of policies which have been pursued out of a mix of just wanting to look like a good person and ideology amongst a certain section of the political class, which they're slowly starting to realise that when it actually gets to grips with it, what sounds wonderful and liberal is actually quite unpleasant and sinister. And I think that the tetchiness will continue the more that gets unveiled.
And there are some really deep contradictions at the heart of it. Yesterday, there was the almost laughable discussion about why people who want the state to end their life need proper mental health assessments and one of the doctors said, because some of them, they're just suicidal. It's like, well, no kidding. I mean, that's so she was arguing that people whose mental health is so poor that they're suicidal should not be allowed to commit suicide. I mean, I can't make sense of that.
Contacting the suicide service seems like the logical place to go.
So you should only be allowed to commit suicide if you're not suicidal. How does that work?
And it's interesting the sort of politics of it. I mean, you're saying Keir Starmer's backing it. I mean, he, officially there's no three-line whip. It's not a Labour Party policy, but it seems to be the only principle that he holds. It seems to have been something that he has pursued himself. He relaxed a lot of the prosecutions around this when he was DPP back in the day. He seems to genuinely believe that this is a progressive moment, that it is his equivalent of legalizing same-sex relationships in the 60s or abortion, as you say. Where does that come from? I mean, how does someone who believes in nothing feel so strongly about this?
Everybody believes in something. Everybody does. If you don't believe, if you're not somebody with a religious worldview, so, your worldview is not based on the teachings of the Bible or the Quran, then your worldview is based on something else. I mean, that might be liberalism. It might be socialism. But, everybody acts as if they believe in something. And the problem with that, I think Keir Starmer's belief system is based on an understanding of human rights. Now, human rights originally comes from the Judeo-Christian view that human life is sacred. But it's been expanded well beyond that because people have been given the rights to all sorts of things which aren't natural rights. Like, do you have the right to healthcare? Well, only if I'm forced to pay for it. I'm not arguing that it's wrong to have a right to healthcare, but these are not kind of natural rights as Edmund Burke would have seen them. And so I think his view is found in this kind of liberal vision of human rights, which ultimate aim is to give every individual full autonomy over everything. And that is the kind of vision of self-actualization. But the truth is nobody has full autonomy. We're all dependent on other people. And if you if you extend that right to the right to kill yourself, then kind of where does that end up? Because how do you then stop other people from coercing you? And, so he obviously does believe in something. And I think it's this kind of extreme version of human rights. But as you said, he's been relaxed about it. He made this absurd promise to Esther Rantzen that he would give time, which makes me think, and I'm obviously speculating, that came, because the way the PMB process works, every MP puts into a hat, essentially. The first 10 that are pulled out have got a good chance. And you can either do something that you've thought of yourself, or the government can hand you a bill. Yeah. And if the government hands you a bill, you'll get time for it, and it will pass. So,
I agree with a lot with that. The one thing I'd say is that this, the characterisation of the assisted suicide thing as a sort of the excess of liberalism is something I have a bit of a problem with, though, because I am struck by the fact that so many people behind this piece of legislation, the only time they believe in freedom of autonomy is when it's for you to request the state to kill you, or for you to remove perfectly healthy body parts to make it more in line with your own view of yourself. Like, they don't trust you to speak for yourself. They don't trust you to feed your own children. They don't trust you to go on the internet unaccompanied, all of these things. And yet it's on these very unique areas that they are suddenly using the language of freedom and autonomy and choice. And I think particularly with assisted suicide, this is the choice they're choosing to valorize. And it's the one that leads to the end of your life, to the destruction of any of autonomy you could possibly experience. I think that says something about, if this is a form of liberalism, it's a particularly morbid and warped.
I suppose the end point of liberalism is authoritarianism, because if the aim of life is to be as autonomous as possible, at the end of the day, what is the only entity that can protect you from having your autonomous choices taken away? It's the state. And so the state is, you see this absolutely in education. Parents don't even have the authority to see what their children are being taught in schools, because the children must have the autonomous right to, self-actualize, whatever it is. And so therefore the state must stop parents from preventing children from seeing it. But yeah, I agree. I mean, it is the most odd thing. And also I think what's been interesting is that the traditional socialists that come from a more kind of Christian tradition have very much allied with the social conservatives in opposing this, whereas the progressives and the liberals or libertarians, the Conservative Party, have united in agreeing with it. So it's kind of thrown the whole left-right dichotomy into disarray, really.
Definitely. Thanks, Miriam. When can we next see you on GB News? This will be out on Friday, I should say.
Okay, Friday evening, I'll be on 6 or 7. It's such a different thing being on the asking question end to the answering, but I'm really enjoying it. And the channel's going from strength to strength. I mean, beating Sky News all the time now, BBC News some of the time. And it is, it's a great fun place to work. I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.